All right. Well, welcome everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces. That's good. Should cut down on the number of questions. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Andy Howard. I'm a program manager on the Azure HPC software and services team, focused on all of our third-party scheduler integration, whether that's with Azure CycleCloud or Azure Batch, and the batch scheduling service. Been involved for, I think this is the 5th year now that Azure has been sponsoring the student cluster competition. So really happy to be back. I love the fact that now we have another cloud component and have some, some of the discussions that it sounds like I was joining into with Sam and Mary around what are the easy things to get started with for cloud providers versus the more difficult things, and what are the things that are maybe a little more flexible versus here's your fixed infrastructure. So just wanted to set up this webinar to answer any questions around how do I get started with CycleCloud? How do I get started deploying clusters, monitoring my spending, all of those types of things. So I don't have like a set agenda. I don't have a slide deck or anything like that, but just wanted to kind of walk through what it's like to actually use CycleCloud. So I know for many of you, the transition to a virtual cluster competition was a bit of a shock. You've had your own clusters that you've been working with for a little bit and trying to figure out, how do I now transition to using this cloud thing? So the biggest thing that I would say is if you had your own cluster that you were planning on bringing to the competition, one of the huge benefits of CycleCloud is we integrate with pretty much all of the mainstream scheduler software out there, right? So whether it's PBS Pro or CycleCloud, or sorry, PBS Pro, Grid Engine, Slurm, LSF, Condor, all of those things. If you log into CycleCloud, you'll probably see something that you're familiar with. If you're not familiar with any of them, I would say probably Grid Engine, PBS, and Slurm are going to be your best choices to getting started, just because they've been the most common for many years. Slurm and PBS are probably the most common these days. Grid Engine, HD Condor, LSF, if you have a license for it, have been around for a little bit longer. So does anybody have questions around what we mean by job schedulers or that type of thing, or why you would choose that versus just trying to deploy your own infrastructure? And this is really meant to be more of an interactive Q&A session, not just Andy talks to slides and goes through a presentation. All right, cool. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started with a Slurm cluster here, just because that's the one that I am the most familiar with. Work with it all the time, and it also has wrapper scripts for if you're used to using some other schedulers. A lot of times this is pretty easy to get started with. So I'm just going to call this cluster my SCC cluster. So all that I did was click the Slurm cluster type, and I have to give it a name. And next, I'm going to be asked a few questions about it. So the region, for those of you who missed this announcement, I've gotten a few questions about this already, but the region that every team is going to be running in is West US 2. The reason why we do this is for consistency and fairness. Azure pricing varies depending on region. And so I've talked to our capacity teams, I've talked to our hardware engineering teams, and West US 2 right now is where they're saying, yeah, we can pretty much get you all the capacity you need in that region. So everybody's going to have the same region, everybody's going to have the same pricing, which really makes things fair. Because if you look at the price between, say, West US 2 and West Europe, there's a decent price difference there. I think it's like $1 or $2 an hour of difference. For the scheduler VM type, in CycleCloud, we basically try and recommend something sane as a default. Unless you have a really compelling reason to change this, I would probably stick with either the DV2 or maybe move to a DV3. But for the most part, this is going to be your best price performance for the scheduler. You're not going to be running a whole lot of computation there. It's just kind of the thing that's going to run the scheduler and any NFS storage that you have. In the Slurm cluster type, and I think also the PBS cluster types, you have an HPC and an HTC VM type. That's really just the difference between high performance computing versus high throughput computing. So if you have parallel jobs, things that need to be on the same InfiniBand fabric, that's where you're going to choose the HPC type. If you have a more throughput workload or serial workload, then that would be more the HTC type. So if you hit this choose button, and I know a few people have asked about this in the past, this was something that I was missing in your permissions for the deployments, but you have the VM type, or what we call the SKU, the tier, which all of these, I think pretty much everything here in here is going to be standard, the number of cores per VM, memory per VM, and then the dollar per hour and dollars per core. Dollars per hour and dollars per core is really something that you're going to want to maximize for the student cluster competition. Now, if you look at this list, this is pretty long. We've got everything from our standard compute SKUs to high performance computing to GPUs to all these other things. If you click on this compute type dropdown, you'll see that we have filters based on high performance computing, GPU, compute optimized, all of those things. Now, one thing you might notice if you've logged in already is that high performance computing is pretty limited. And even if you go to GPU, you get nothing here. This is showing what's available to you today. I am currently fighting, I don't want to say fighting, working with our capacity teams to get Quota approved for the subscription that everybody's sharing. So hopefully within the next 24 hours, you should see a lot more of this pop up. What I'm currently trying to get everyone is access to HBV2, which is our CPU bound AMD Rome architecture, and then also NCV3, which is a NVIDIA V100, NDV2, which is another V100 VM type, but it's 8 V100 cards, each with their own InfiniBand interconnect, and then also NDV4, which I'm hoping to get, which is an A100 VM type. So those are the main groups of capacity that I'm trying to get today. Does anyone on the call have any interest in other VM types or other Quota capacity that they're looking for?
Can you repeat which ones were the A100s?
NDV4 is the A100 VM type.
Okay, thank you.
I do see a request in chat for HBV3. I have asked for that as well. It's kind of going to come down to whether they want to, whether they can get that to us. HBV3 is the same, pretty much the same as HBV2. The only difference is an AMD Milan architecture versus AMD Rome. The price is the same, everything else is the same. So we'll try and get that for you, but otherwise it's going to be HBV2.
A question that others might also have is the dollars per core is simply the dollars per hour divided by the number of cores that the VM provides?
Correct, yeah. And as you look at evaluating the clusters that you're deploying, the dollars per core or core dollars per hour is going to be kind of the key metric that you want to look at. All right, so for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to pick something simple. Actually, we'll just stick with the F2 SV2. So once you've chosen your VM types, you then pick the auto scaling side of things. So now this is definitely going to be a strategy for your team. You can either enable auto scaling where CycleCloud determines based on the job queue, this is how many cores I need to satisfy this workload versus this is what I'm, have available to me. So I've chosen a 2-core VM right now, so 100 cores is probably fine. Maybe we want to just change this to 1,000 for example purposes. Our HTC cores, we'll leave it 100. The max VMs per scale set. So I don't think you guys are really going to ever hit a case where you need more than 40 VMs on a single InfiniBand fabric. But as you look at the HBV2, HBV3, NC series, ND series, like all of those VM types, they are backed by InfiniBand. And so what this max VMs per scale set parameter adjusts is how many VMs will CycleCloud attempt to put on a single InfiniBand fabric. So in the case of the competition, 40 VMs is probably way overkill for what you're going to need, but just something to be aware of. The spot VM parameter is one that by default, we only really enable this for the HTC VM type, the high throughput VM type. I'm guessing we're going to get questions around, can I use spot VMs for HPC just because they're a fraction of the cost? There are trade-offs for using spot VMs. So the biggest trade-off is it's roughly 80 to 90% of the cost of 80 to 90% discount of the cost of a normal pay-as-you-go VM. So it can be significant cost savings. The biggest drawback is you can get preempted at any time. And as you start looking at MPI jobs and the more and more VMs that you add to that MPI job, the higher the likelihood is that you might be evicted from your VM while your job is running. And this can, for larger MPI jobs, this can have a significant impact on your workload. So I will provide another template in the chat that enables this, the spot VM capability for high performance computing workloads, the more parallel workloads, but just be aware, that's going to be a trade-off that your team has to decide on. And if you get evicted during the competition, that's up to you. There's not going to be there's no refund for credits that were spent on that. There's nothing to adjust for that. Subnet ID, this has come up a few times, as well as the region. All of the teams are locked to West US2. So when you click this dropdown, you should only have one subnet to pick from. You have to click on this dropdown. You can't leave it blank. You can't put in whatever you want. You have to pick the subnet that you're actually assigned to. Just 1 second. All right, so the network attached storage, for all of your purposes, the built-in NFS type should be sufficient. You shouldn't have to go and deploy any other NFS server or deploy an Azure NetApp Files service, which is what a lot of our customers do in production. But for the most part, for the competition, you should just be able to use the built-in NFS type. This deploys an NFS server on your head node of your cluster. So, make this a few terabytes and you should be good there. Advanced settings, for the most part, you shouldn't have to mess with this page. Now, the one thing I will say, and I'm still working on trying to verify this with our platform team, is there is a version of the CentOS 7 image that has NVIDIA drivers pre-installed. I don't think we have the same image for CentOS 8. So if you choose CentOS 7 as your OS image, then if you pick a GPU SKU, you should get all of the appropriate NVIDIA drivers installed. So I'm working with them just to verify that that's the case here. Everything else on this page, you can probably leave blank. Return proxy, you can go ahead and turn off. Public head node, you'll want to leave on. If you want to be able to log in directly to execute nodes, then go ahead and check the public execute box. But I will reiterate the same thing I said when I granted access to everyone. Please do not enable password access to anything that has a public IP in the environment. The Azure IP space is targeted very heavily by hackers. And so I have seen machines with weak IPs or weak passwords, and even what I would consider fairly strong passwords, but maybe in a password list, be owned within 30 minutes of being deployed. So by default, CycleCloud does not enable password access, and that is what I would recommend for all of you. Sam, your question about CentOS 8 getting NVIDIA drivers before the competition. I don't think the CentOS HPC image is going to have NVIDIA drivers, mostly because of the end of life aspect of things. We were marching down that path, and then CentOS or Red Hat announced end of life for CentOS 8. So for the most part, our focus right now is on CentOS 8. We do have some preliminary support for some other Linux variants, but I don't know on the HPC side what plans are for drivers. You are, of course, welcome to deploy a CentOS 8 image and install the drivers yourself. So that's another route you can go down, but that adds to boot up time and all of that. All right, so now that we've chosen all of those options, if we come down here, click Save on the cluster. If you do need to do some like last minute configuration, maybe you want to run some scripts to install NVIDIA drivers or do whatever, the Cloud Init section, you can run a separate script for the scheduler, the HPC nodes, the HTC nodes, and all of that can be done through here. You can either use Cloud Init directly. So Cloud Init, for those of you who don't know, is an industry standard. Think of it as last mile configuration for your nodes as they're deployed. So I need to install some packages, or I need to make a few changes to the image that I'm using. Cloud Init's the way to do that. So the most common method that I see customers using is just, you can essentially just do a drop a shell script in here and say, yum install my packages, and Cloud Init will go and run that for you. The key thing to note, and for those of you who have used CycleCloud before, we do have a cluster init, which is the more CycleCloud way of doing things. Cluster init runs at the very end of when nodes are being deployed. Cloud Init is the very first thing to run on the node. So if you need to do things like change the Slurm configuration or do anything like that, you won't be able to do that in Cloud Init. You'll need to go and look up cluster init projects, and I'll provide some links in the chat to how those are defined and what they mean. So once I've saved my cluster configuration, I basically have a placeholder within CycleCloud. And at this point, I probably just need to start it. So go ahead and hit start. And this will take probably about 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes to start up. Anyone on the call, have you gone through this process? Have you been able to log in and start playing around with CycleCloud? See a thumbs up from Mary.
And thumbs up for me as my team. Let's get that really clear.
Sure,
No, I've done
yep.
some, but the students are able to access it and use it.
Our team was training on Oracle Cloud over the weekend, and so I don't think we've gotten onto Azure yet. I don't know if somebody from our team is here. Then oh no, I don't think anyone from our team is here yet. So I think it's safe to assume that we haven't yet, but we will soon.
Sure. So let me just switch over, since we're waiting on this to start up, let me switch over to my own CycleCloud install that I use regularly, because I can log into this. So one of the key things to bear in mind when you start this cluster, if you notice when I click the start button, the only thing that's starting is the scheduler. And this is kind of the key component to CycleCloud. It's one of the main reasons why most of our customers use us is we don't run infrastructure unless you're going to use it. So for most use cases, the scheduler node will start up and stay running throughout the lifecycle of the cluster, but we won't start any actual compute resources until jobs are submitted. So if I go over here, actually, let me go back to this. So I've got a single, if I look at Slurm custom config, I've got a single scheduler running, and I've got two partitions defined within Slurm that these nodes are in the off state. So they're going to sit there idle, actually sit there turned off until I actually submit work for them to do. So now if I log in here, and log into my cluster. So if I do an sinfo, I can see I've got the same nodes defined here, an HPC and HTC partition that I have in my cluster, right? So I've got one node in the HPC partition, I've got 50 nodes in the HTC partition, which matches what I have defined in CycleCloud. So now if I go and I submit a job, so let's say dispatch, submit it to HTC, we'll say 2 nodes. We're just going to submit a dummy job here. So I submit a job that's just going to run host name across 2 of these HTC nodes. So if I refresh this, then I can see that now CycleCloud has basically, well, Slurm has asked CycleCloud, hey, go and start 2 nodes from this partition. So the nice thing is CycleCloud's going to start those nodes. They'll join the Slurm cluster. It'll run my job. And then after about 5 minutes of idle time, Slurm's going to go ahead and shut those back down. And so for the purposes of the competition, especially, we're trying to keep costs down, using Autoscale is definitely recommended, because otherwise you have to be the one who sits there and shepherds your cluster and turns nodes on and off as they're needed. So by using the power of Autoscale in CycleCloud, you can actually take advantage of it's going to start the right things. Similarly, if you have a job that's requested multiple nodes and they're in, for Slurm clusters, if they're in the HPC partition, for other clusters, if you're just requesting multiple nodes from the same job, CycleCloud will allocate those VMs on the same InfiniBand fabric. And so you don't have to worry so much about where are these nodes getting deployed? Are they going to be co-located? Am I going to have to worry about the latency between the nodes? CycleCloud handles a large part of that for you. The other main thing that you'll see, and I'm going to send out another email probably tomorrow morning, looking at the time, but CycleCloud will give you a real-time insight into what this cluster is costing you. So right now I can see I've got 3 VMs deployed. what I'm being billed for right now is about 56 cents per hour. For this particular cluster, I've had it running for a little while, so I've spent $9 in the last day. If I mouse over this, I can see I've spent $59 roughly in the last 7 days. The other piece that I'm going to be sending out to teams is there is actually a REST API you can query to get the same information. The nice thing about the REST API is that is an aggregate across all of your clusters. So you can see what your spend has been for everything and everything deployed in your SCC environment. Right now, it's basically since the beginning of time. During the competition, we'll reset that counter and it will be since the beginning of the competition. The other thing you'll be able to see is your what we call the burn rate. So the dollars per hour that you're spending for your entire cluster, which can be really important as you start to look at, am I going to go over budget? You know, what's this actually costing me? If I run this thing for the next hour, what's that going to actually do to my budget? So that's the other part of the API that I'll be sending information for.
Andy, I have a,
Mhm.
maybe I missed this because I got distracted, but when we will develop and train on the CycleCloud portal that you gave us this
Mhm.
week or last week, whenever the day was that it got, you emailed us, too much happening. But then when the competition starts on Monday at 7 p.m. or whenever it starts, will you reset completely that portal? Will you give us a new CycleCloud? Will we be able to keep, in other words, VMs that the students have already built up in the training CycleCloud portal?
Yeah, that's a great question. As long as you haven't gone over budget for your training, in which case, if you do go over budget for training, then I'm going to shut down your environments. But if
Yeah,
you
I don't
haven't
blame
gone,
you.
yeah, if you haven't gone over budget, then you will basically be able to run the same, keep the same cluster running. I'm not
Oh,
going to
excellent.
redeploy the CycleCloud environments.
Okay, yeah, I mean, probably our VMs will be turned off, but the
Mhm.
ones that the students build up and store and build into that left-hand navigation menu, the
Mhm.
different ones that they'll be building up, if they're still there, then that will be
Yes.
really, really kind and gentle of the committee to allow that. Okay, super.
Yeah, and again, I mean, if you look at the cost of this cluster, this $9 in the last 24 hours, this is basically just the cost of the scheduler node. I think I've run a couple of tests on this
Okay.
environment, but for the most part, you know, $10 a day is pretty reasonable to expect for that.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Okay, so if we don't go over budget, any VMs that we have up and running but not launching anything on the scheduler, we could just keep those running because they're very inexpensive.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, that's a great suggestion. Thanks.
Any other questions? I think at this point, that's mainly what I wanted to go through. But if you've got questions or concerns about using the environment, please let me know. So Benjamin, I see your question in chat around how can we use different file systems. I don't know if you want to come off mute and ask that and clarify like what types of file systems are you looking at? Or if you just want to ask in chat. Okay, so we do have a BGFS cluster template in CycleCloud. If you go and search for on GitHub, or even if you just search for CycleCloud BGFS, what you'll find is there is an example project up on GitHub. If you go to the templates directory, actually no, it's under examples. There is an example template for using PVS with BGFS. The changes you need to make for Slurm are very similar. Essentially, you just need to include on the execute nodes. Thought it was in here. Oh, it might be in the default section. Yeah, in the default section, there's this cluster init line to include the BGFS client and BGFS default projects. So you can include those into either a PBS template, Slurm, whatever. It'll work pretty much the same. I will say, my personal recommendation for the competition itself, you're not going to be running at a scale that BGFS will probably make that much of a difference. And so that's probably going to eat into your budget a little bit. So that would be the main thing that I would recommend there. I see a question in chat. Can we use some custom images? So this has been something we've kind of gone back and forth for a few years on with the competition. The short answer is yes. If you want to bake software into an image, you can contact me. And at least up until the week before the competition, I can create a custom image and you can use that in there. Now, there's going to be a bit of back and forth or a bit of a limitation in terms of how often I'm going to have to be the one to go create a custom image for you. We do have a set of recommended HPC images that are published by the Azure HPC team. Some of those are available just in the dropdown. For example, if you choose when you're creating your cluster, go to advanced settings. These images are basically the recommended HPC images for the HPC platform on Azure. The Ubuntu image is a little bit older. We do have an HPC image. I'll publish that URL later to the teams because that will have the latest InfiniBand and GPU drivers installed. But for the most part, I would recommend sticking to what we have here and then using Cloud Init to make any changes to the images as you deploy them. Other questions?
Yeah, maybe really quickly, can you explain like the auto scaling, why that's important again?
Sure, yeah. So one of the key things, so typically when you talk about the cloud and auto scaling, most cloud providers, the mechanism for auto scaling is based on the load or memory resources that are available on running VMs. The key thing with CycleCloud is the auto scaling is based off of the job queue. So it's really based on the work that is scheduled to be done. This is really nice for HPC workloads in particular because pretty much everything is based off of I have these jobs that I've submitted and these are the resources they need. So when we talk about auto scaling in CycleCloud, it's looking at here are the jobs that are queued up and or running, and these are all of the resources that they need in order to run. So if I come back here, for example, to my this custom config cluster, if you notice when we first started this cluster, there wasn't anything running. And in fact, during the time we've been talking, we started the 2 nodes to run that job. If I do an SQ now, there's nothing in the queue. So after it ran that workload, it actually went and shut those back down. So from a cost perspective and from a cost management perspective, which most of the teams are going to be worried about, This helps minimize the cost. So we only run resources when you need them. Otherwise, you're down to this. Looks like the head node of this is just costing me about 30 cents per hour versus spending, $5 an hour, $10 an hour, $50 an hour.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question. So if you were trying to install a driver, you probably want to do that beforehand, right? You wouldn't use auto-scaling for that, right? It's just for when you're running jobs for your applications. Is that correct?
Right. So that's where I would say either if you're trying to install a driver, then I would recommend using one of our published images just because we do keep those up to date. Otherwise, if you have a custom driver you want to install, installing that via Cloud Init would basically install that for all of the jobs that are going to be run. So that way you're not trying to run that as part of the job. Some of the driver installs, particularly in NVIDIA's and Mellanox's drivers, can take a long time to run. And so that's where I would say, again, my recommendation is using our official images. But otherwise, if you have custom images, let me know. We can work on that and try and get that published for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Question in chat. So we have Optane memory chassis this year. I don't believe we have anything with Optane memory. Around A100s, I am trying to get our NDV4, which is currently in public preview, available for teams, but that's kind of down to the capacity management team. So worst case, we'll have V100s with 8 cards per node, but I am trying to get A100s available. As far as will that be a shortage for the competition? To be quite honest, the price of those VMs is fairly high, so I would be surprised if any team can monopolize our capacity in that region. I do just want to highlight when you look at the edit tab for your cluster, as you're looking at required settings and the VM types, this selection menu, as long as hide unavailable is checked here, you will only see things that are available to the competition. So you have the quota and available here. So quota is your total quota. So if I look at DV3, for example, this is my personal subscription, so ignore these numbers. But in this case, I've got 8,800 cores of quota, but I've only got 8,700 available. So this is just a nice way to see like what's actually available to that subscription.
And that available is momentarily available in the sense of nobody else
Correct.
is using it right now.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, that number might change.
Yep. Sam, your question about auto scaling, it is turned on by default, but you will probably see if you click the new cluster button here, ignore my mess of a personal install. The default scaling limits are fairly low. So especially if you choose to use like HBV2, for example, that's a minimum of 120 cores per VM. So this auto scaling limit by default will give you 0 cores, just because we do choose the floor of what you've set. Great question around the delete button. Let me look into that. I'm guessing you probably only have cluster create permissions, and that does not always imply cluster delete permissions. So I'll probably have to add that. If you do have a cluster that you've, come in here, you've spun up, you've decided I'm done with this, I don't want to pay for it anymore, just hit the terminate button. as that's shut down, you shouldn't be paying for anything after that's terminated. It just may lead to things piling up in this left-hand menu, and I'll get that sorted out. Oh, Mary, does delete cluster work from the command line?
I believe it did for us last year. So let me check with Max and a couple of my students from last year, and I'll let you know and see if I can grab the command that they used last year. I seem
Okay.
to remember that they were able to figure that out, and it was the command line interface.
Yep. Yeah. Either way, I'll get the UI working again too there.
Okay.
So just a question of the permissions they're granted.
You mean through the portal? That would be awesome.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Okay.
For those of you who don't know, so 2 resources, and I'll provide these links later. First of all, if you go to, even if you search for Azure CycleCloud, one of the first things that you'll run across is the Azure CycleCloud documentation page. And this does cover, you know, on the quick starts guide and tutorials, like how do I start a cluster? How do I run jobs? How does auto start and auto stop work? But then also in here is things around how do I install the CycleCloud CLI? So one of the things, if you start to look at creating custom templates and things like that with CycleCloud, you will need the CycleCloud CLI component to run that. That is part of your CycleCloud install, so you can install that locally. You can install that on any nodes that you deploy, wherever you want to run it. But that's just a useful tool for you to have. You can basically do, well, you can do anything you see in the UI, you can do all of that from a command line interface. That actually predates the UI. Yeah, I think that was the main thing that I wanted to say there.
So we're coming close to 2 p.m. Pacific time. Sounds like the questions are winding down. Does anybody have any kind of final question they'd like to bring up? So yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks, Andy, for all the work preparing and kind of making this whole section possible, as well as for this walkthrough. I think it's been quite useful.
Yep, happy to help.
So we recorded this. We'll make it available to everybody here and all of the teams in the SCC. So typically the way we've made these webinars available is by putting them on YouTube and setting up a YouTube link, which means it's public. I guess, given that this was a very Q&A oriented session with a few people here, does anybody have any, I guess, objections or concerns to it being completely public? Because that's certainly the easiest, but we could also post a link in the chat to it, in the Slack, I mean, to it, that's a little more restricted.
I'm okay.
Yeah, I have no problem
Sure.
with it.
Sounds like no concerns there. All right, so we'll get that link out kind of as soon as we can.
So Andy, actually, I had a question for you. so our team hasn't had a chance to work with Azure yet. And my team members are my team students. My students are busy with juggling with classes and apparently quizzes and stuff like that. If they have any questions, are you going to be available on Slack? Is that the best way to contact you?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the best way to reach out this year.
Okay. Thank you. I'll
Just
direct the screens to them then, and I'll direct the screens to you then on Slack.
Sounds good. Yeah, and just to be clear, my typical workday is, normal Eastern US time work hours, but I'll try and make